Basically, I'm going to be interviewing my mother so that we have this recorded for our whole family also, because it involves my mother, my father, Oliver Shalom, the previous generations, myself, and the new generations. And one of the things that became apparent yesterday when I went looking for some simple information about my father, I came across a treasure trove. I don't have time. I have actual letters, telegrams that were sent back and forth during the war years that give all the information. I have a letter my father wrote to his parents back in America from where he was working in London on VJ Day and describing the euphoria. And I'll read you some of the things that he had written, but that's much later in the story. It's called Enigma because that's basically what my father had worked on. But we're taking Enigma for all the other things. Before Enigma became publicized, okay, I took this from the dictionary, an absolute riddle, which the whole story is, an obscure speech or writing, which it also is, and one that is puzzling, ambiguous, and inexplainable. And that basically is the story that my mother will be relating, okay? It is a story of not the death camps, but of the life that went on in World War II in England, the life of a religious American soldier, and how it evolved in many, many ways, okay? Mom, would you start with background history?
Well, my grandfather Mayer came to England before World War II, quite well before World War II. He lived in Poland in a place outside of Warsaw. He had an inn there, and they used to put up people for hospitality.
They ran the inn.
Huh?
They owned and ran this inn.
Owned and ran.
A shop.
And the police used to come, he used to give them free drinks. He made his own wines, his own liqueurs, and
It was a kosher hotel.
all kosher, of course. And my mother said she remembers sitting in the deep windowsills of the inn, watching the horses bring in, with carriages to bring in the guests, and a hostler takes them away, the horses, to put them in the stable. And she remembers sitting in these wide window sills making paper flowers as a little girl. And one Simchas Torah, he got a little inebriated, and the police arrested him for being drunk and put him in prison. And my mother, grandmother, had to come with kosher food to the prison because there was no kosher food in prison. And he got so fed up, he said, if this is the way they treat me here, I'm leaving. And he had sisters living in London, and he went to England, and his wife, my grandmother, was an ailing lady, and she didn't want to go with him. She said, it's a trade for land, and I'm not going. And so she didn't go, and my mother was sent as a young teenager to take care of him. She went through Europe with a tag. He had a sister living in Europe somewhere, and finally she got to London, and she started her schooling in London at the age of about 12, I think. And of course every year her birthday was a different year because she went by the Hebrew date. And the teacher said to her, you've got to pick a date, the one date that's your birthday. And that year it was August 9th, so that's what she chose as her birthday. Anyway, but that was sad, of course. Most of my father's family died in the Holocaust. I had a grandmother who was in her 80s. Now, the family gave a lot of, they were farmers, and one uncle used to do horseback riding. They loved horses.
Do you remember the name of the village?
The village was Chechenov. Chechenov. And it was,
They owned this big farm. They were farmers.
Yeah, they were farmers. And they gave a lot of the land that they owned to the municipality as gifts for the school, for the police station, for other places. When the Nazis came in, they took over the village, and they were mistreating the people in the village. And my grandmother, who was in her 80s, stood up to the Nazis and said, you know, you can't treat them like this and that. So they shot her, and she got killed. Now, she was bringing up a granddaughter, her granddaughter, because the parents were too, they were both in business. They owned a shop, and they couldn't take care of her. So the grandmother took her, and she lived with them. And the granddaughter was there when she was shot, so she ran away. It was winter time, and the river nearby was frozen, and she was able to run away. And she found work with a priest in Poland, and she took over her non-Jewish friend's identity and worked for him. But he noticed as the year went by, she had no shoes, they were threadbare, and she wasn't buying any new ones, and he realized she was Jewish. And so he accosted her, and so she had to run away again. This granddaughter finally, when I was living in America already, we sponsored her to come over to Hartford, Connecticut. She had a very sad life. She got married and had a child, and both were killed in the Holocaust. And she remarried in the DP camp. And she went, then had this boy in the DP camp. So he's the only survivor of her part of the family.
Now that whole family, Mom, it's only a year ago that we found out how many aunts and uncles, how many children Grandpa was of.
Yeah, he was
This
one
was
of many
information
siblings,
we never knew.
and we never knew about. So
A year ago, we met with someone.
yeah, and they were lost in the Holocaust. Part of my father's family came to Ramat Gan, but they were sent to Siberia from Poland when the Nazis came in, and they were there in Siberia until the end of the war, and then they went to a DP camp, and two brothers of his came to England. One was a butcher, so he got a job in Bloom's Delicatessen in the East End of London. And the other one, forgotten what he was doing. Whatever it was, he found a job, and my father set him up in London, in Stamford Hill. And
Now, how did your father escape or leave before World War II?
yes,
What was his story? He left.
he left because when he was 14, they were taking the Jewish boys for the army. He lived in Galicia, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian regime, and so he ran away to Antwerp, and he apprenticed there in the diamond trade, and he became a diamond merchant, and he was one of the first members of the Diamond Club in Hatton Garden in London. And and he died at the age of 90, he died, I think he was 82 when he died.
Now, he had a brother
He had a brother,
in
Moshe.
Belgium.
Moshe came to live in Kiraona, and
But his life was saved because he was also sent to Siberia.
yeah, he was sent with his family to Siberia, and he was a butcher also. And when he came to Kiraona, a lot of the chevra that he had in Poland, all these people came together because they were all in a DP camp before they came to Israel. And he and his wife had a daughter, and in their late years they had a son who was born, and unfortunately the son got married. He was in the army. And
Not unfortunately, he got married. But he got married.
He got married, and he was out of the army. He was an electrician, and he walked into a live wire, and he got electrocuted and died at a very, very young age. And he left a boy, Tzvika, who went to Boris Town in Jerusalem, and he had also a daughter who lives now.
Going back to
in
the old
Mosul.
family history, there was another brother in Belgium.
There was one brother in Belgium who died in the 1930s. He was a sportsman, and I guess he caught pneumonia playing football or something, and he passed away and left a wife with 2 boys. Now, this wife was a cosmetician, and they fled Brussels, where they were living, when the Germans came into Belgium. And they went down to the south of France. And one of the little boys was out riding his bike, and the French police came from Vichy, that area, and asked him where his mother was, and he took them to his mother, and they were taken away, and nobody heard anymore what happened to them. They were one of my brothers, who was in the Air Force, was sent over to Piedmont to find out where the missiles were coming from. Towards the end of the war, we had V2s, like the missiles that come to Gaza, and they wanted to know where they were coming from, the British, so they could bomb the place. And he went over on a search there to Belgium and made inquiries about this aunt of mine, and he got that was the story he got, that she and the boys perished. So that was that end of that part of the family. Now, is there anybody else?
Let's go now to England. So your father was in England in the
My father came over
as a single, and Grandma
Yeah.
was there taking care of her father.
My mother was staying with cousins, living with cousins. She was single, quite attractive, and the cousins had a friend in Belgium who was my grandfather, and they how can I put it this way? They
saw a picture.
They sent pictures of one another, and he liked the picture of my mother, but she didn't like his picture because he was taken with another friend, and they had these long spats that the men used to wear, buttoned up spats, and she said they look like 2 bobs. So her cousin said, well, if you don't like it, send his picture back. So she sent the picture back, and but the next thing is he came to London, and he courted her, and he was very good looking. He looked like a film star, and so anyway, they got married and had I had two brothers and I was the youngest. Their oldest child died, unfortunately, of cancer, skin cancer. My two brothers, one was in the Air Force, one was in the Army, and myself. I was not in the forces, but I did work as a...
What age were you when war broke out?
When war broke out, I was about 12 or 13, and Poland, Germany walked into Poland September 1st, 1939, and that was on a Wednesday. Friday, the 3rd, England declared war on Germany, and I and all the school children in London were evacuated to the country, to places where there were no factories or anything which could be bombed, to save the children, save their lives. And I, at that time, even so young an age, thought to myself, isn't it wonderful that the government thinks about the future generation? Because I suppose if the Germans came and invaded England and took over the country, what would happen? There'd be no young people left. So anyway, a lot of the children, some of the children were sent out to the colonies, to Canada and to Australia, and we also took in 10,000 kinder transport children. They had to come in on visas that gave them as domestic help. That was one of the reasons they were allowed to come in. But at least we saved their lives. Unfortunately, some of them were adopted by non-Jewish families. But a lot of these children, they had a record of them, and they did finally, most of them go back to their parents. Whoever survived, not many survived, but whatever, the families took them back. But anyway, we were sent away, and for the whole first year, nothing was happening.
Did you go to school there?
Everything was quiet. School hadn't been set up. We were sent away with the teachers. The teachers took care of us, but they didn't have a program. The kinder transport children had proper supervision. They had a boys' school where boys lived in a hostel. We were sent to Northampton, which was in the Midlands of England, and the boys were taken care of. And I remember going to shul on Shabbos and meeting these young people there, girls and boys. But the women who took in the children in Northampton, we were put into a very, very poor area of Northampton. We were near shoe factories. I remember the shoe factories being at the back of us. And if anybody ever used to see the BBC, the EastEnders, there were movies about the EastEnders, terraced homes and us pedestrians in the window. You could climb in through the front window and get into the living room. And a lot of these people took children in because they were paid by the government to do so, but they didn't have room for the children. My next door friend with her sister were sleeping in the bathtub because the husband had a heart problem and he needed his bedroom and she had her bedroom, and that's all there was. So it was a very disorganized life, let me tell you.
And that was for how long that you were there in the country?
I was only there 10 days, but the others were there we were just going into high school. So the others were there the whole of high school. And that was a long time. That was a number of years, 4 years. So it was not an easy life. The parents used to come up to visit them maybe once a month, because it was a train ride. It was quite a distance. So I went with my family. They finally got together a few families in London, and they went and rented homes at the sea in Worthing, which is near Brighton. And I went there and started business school there because I didn't want to go back to regular school. So I went to a business school.
At what age was that, though?
I was 14, 15. Now, the first year we were away as evacuees, there was nothing going on. London had these big balloons up in the air connected with wires so that the Germans couldn't come in at low and bomb the people. So it was quiet for a while. And then all of a sudden, they started putting fire bombs down, which is a similar thing to the kites now that they're putting out. So they put down fire bombs. I had a job when we went back to London. We had gone back because it was quiet, and all of a sudden this fire bombs business started. I was about 17 by then, and I took a job as a legal secretary, not knowing or realizing that we were exempt from being called up. At the age of 18, they called the girls up to go into the Army or the Air Force or the Navy, and I was fortunate. I didn't even know that this exempted me. It wasn't until I gave up my work at the law office because I got married and I was pregnant and ready to leave for America, that they then mailed me call-up papers. But of course I told them that I wasn't going to be in the country much longer. I was waiting for a ticket to go to America. So they left me alone, so I wasn't in any of the forces. But I did bomb watching. I used to, when the siren sounded, I'd run up with my helmet. I had a big helmet, heavy helmet on, carrying the tea and the coffee because I was the youngest one of the whole group up there. And I used to man the switchboard and report whenever bombs fell, because whenever they fell in a line. And so the fire brigade could come and put the fires out. So that was my job. So I did that until I got married, I guess, and got pregnant.
Now, you're talking about getting married, how did you meet your husband?
My mother used to give hospitality to boys in the service. We had a free Frenchman come, we had Canadian come, we had this one and that one, and one of them was an American, and we used to talk on the phone, and he was invited to come for Seder. Now, we had 2 nights Seder in London, like you did in America, and the first night the boys made their own. He was already working on the Enigma, which I didn't know about, and the boys, the American services, sent them matzah and wine, and the boys made their own Seder. And the interesting thing is, do you know Shmuel Becker,
Yeah,
the lawyer?
I know.
You know him? His uncle was the host for those boys. I didn't tell you that. For those boys that were made the Seder.
The first night.
For the first night. The second night.
Now, also, Dad had been given, because he was religious and could only eat certain food,
Yeah.
he was given the key to the commissary for the whole time that he was in the space.
Well, he used to take up a lot of KP duty, kitchen duty, so he could pick out what he could eat and drink. So that was how he was able to manage until he came to my mother. Then he used to come for meals to my mother. and she was a good cook. So, they were stationed. He joined the. He volunteered for the American Army after Pearl Harbor, and he was already 32 when he joined. So he was the oldest of the whole unit, and evidently they sent him for training to the Chicago Navy Yard, where the British were teaching them about radar. It was just beginning to be taught them, radar. And that was where he learned radar. And then they were also working on television at that time. England already had a television studio and was set up for television.
What year was that?
Crystal Palace.
What year?
It was in the 1930s. It was the mid-1930s. But America wasn't that advanced yet. And they got later, they got advanced. Anyway, they were sent over through Scotland, Greenock, and then they were sent to Manchester, England, north of England, and then they were sent down to London. And they were assigned to work on the Enigma, and Dwight D. Eisenhower was their commander-in-chief. General Alexander Montgomery didn't believe that it had accomplished anything, but Winston Churchill did believe in it, and they worked on it. He encouraged them, and they were stationed in Selfridge's sub-basement. Selfridge's is like Macy's department store. It's a huge department store in the middle of the West End of London, and they had a sub-basement, and that was where their headquarters were. But they lived out in Ruislip, which was all I can say, it's at the end of the Bakerloo line, which was the underground. They helped to build the airfield there in Ruislip, and they would go in every day to Selfridge's. Now Selfridge's got a hit with a landmine, which fortunately didn't explode, but it only reached the sub-basement, basement. It did not reach the sub-basement, which was lower. And that landmine was found after World War II, after it was finished, that they were able to, get it out without exploding.
But Dad's going, the second night of Pesach that he wanted wasn't provided for on base.
No, he came the second night. He walked from Harrow on the Hill, where they were living, which was a very high-class college, and he walked was looking for our house.
It was about 6 miles.
Yeah, he had a piece of paper with instructions, with the address, and my father was going to shul, and he saw him. He was in civilian clothes because of the work he was doing. He didn't have to wear uniform, and he said to him, "Who are you looking for?" He said, "I'm looking for the Buckland family." He said, "Well, go down the road," he said, "and knock on the door, and they'll give you a hot drink and something, and then my daughter will show you how to come to shul." So that's what happened. He knocked on the door, and I opened the door, and he looked down because he was a lot taller than me, and, and that's how we met. So, and we call him the man who came to dinner, because he stayed for life.
Did you take him to shul? Did you take him to shul?
Yeah, and I took him to shul.
But originally, when Grandma was called, could she accept another soldier?
So at the beginning, it was like Bashir, because they called him, my cousin was at the Jewish forces desk of the club in Piccadilly Circus, and he came up and asked her for an Orthodox home for Pesach, for the Seder, and she didn't know of anybody who was Shomer Shabbos except our family, so she called my mother and said, would she please put him up? And so she said she had no room. She said she had 5 Canadians coming, and my 2 brothers were coming home, and that was it. She had no room. So my cousin said, he's the only one that's ever asked for an Orthodox home. Usually they want a Jewish home for a meal and everything, but it doesn't, they never mention Orthodox. So my mother said, all right, we'll put more water in the soup and sleep him at a neighbour, and we'll push him up. So that's how he came.
But the others never came.
Oh, the others never did, because it was just before D-Day. And this was March, and June was D-Day. They cancelled all leaves. My brothers didn't come home. The Canadians didn't come. The only one who came was my husband. He was the only one. So he got the full attention. So and that was how we met. So it was, and then I never knew that what work he was doing.
Before going into the work, talk about your getting engaged, getting married.
Oh, well, so I have here an engagement picture and a write-up. Let me see. Okay.
Now, this was wartime.
This was wartime.
So there was no correspondence between my father's family in America and the family in England. Letters were not sent. Everything was done through the base. So there are letters that we've unearthed that my grandparents used to write to my father at his base in New York or New Jersey, which is where he did his, Virginia, where he did his training for code work. Okay, and then they, through the army pouch, would get the mail to England, because there were no planes, and even boats were sunk.
Passed around.
Where did you find those? Where did you find those letters? Where did you find these?
My grandparents in America kept them and gave them over to my parents, and I now have gotten them. I have a file. Unreal. Unreal.
My father-in-law was the first Shomer Shabbos police commissioner in Hartford, Connecticut. And whenever it became Yom Tov or Shabbos, they knew not to call Mr. Goldman because he wouldn't answer, and to call his deputy instead. So he was that.
So how was it getting married in England during wartime? Everything was rationed.
Well, we had a beautiful wedding at the Wembley Town Hall. There were 450 people there. It was the first big wedding of the war, and it was just my side of the family, and his unit came. His unit was consisting 75% of Jewish boys, because you needed to have a very high IQ. They used to look for people who would think out of the box, who were good at crossword puzzles and everything like that. And they were trained. Day and night they used to work. They used to give them pills to keep them awake, because they used to have to work around the clock, sometimes 2-3 days at a time. Now, when we were married, he was allowed to live off campus. He lived in our house, and when I'd be going to work in the morning, he'd be coming home to sleep off for a day or two, because they had to work just so many hours. And unless you decoded the coding in a matter of a certain time, it was useless to you because it's already happened. And the work they did, America was sending food to England because we were starving. We didn't have much food there. We couldn't get our fruits and vegetables we used to get from South Africa. The only thing we grew in England was tomatoes and strawberries and nothing else. So everything else, apples I think we could get because we grew our own apples and our own apple trees. And so the U-boats, the German U-boats used to sink all the boats coming in. And by decoding and knowing what the routes of the U-boats were, they were able to sink them. And then they became like head of the Navy. They had all the jurisdiction over the Atlantic Ocean, and that was one of the benefits. Now there's a book that was put out in 1970 by Colonel Winterbottom. He was an English major or something, and he wrote about the whole history of World War II, including about the Enigma. In England they called it the Ultra Secret, and the book where it is still called the Ultra Secret of Bletchley, where the British were working, and a lot of these kinder transport children had grown up and were working. First of all, they knew German, and second of all, they were pretty bright, and they were able to do a lot of decoding for England. And the Americans were doing their own decoding where they were in Selfridges. So this book, if you can get hold of it, I gave it to my husband as a gift just before we left America for Israel, not knowing that was the work he was doing. He never said a word. They took an oath and that they would never disclose any of this information that they were working on, or they would be shot for treason. And one of the young boys kept a diary, and he became very friendly, and it was very coincidental, with a journalist from Reuters. And they arrested him, and my husband had to vouch for his character and get him off. I don't know if he went to jail at least for a short time, but at least they didn't shoot him. And he became, many years later, vice president of Lytton Industries. He was a very clever young man. He was Sephardi. He lived in Great Neck, Long Island, and they went to the Spanish and Portuguese shore in New York for the Untitled. They would go to a hotel and stay over there. Anyway, we met him many, many years later, and
Mom, to go back to the wedding, you had a very interesting, getting a wedding dress,
right. We had clothing coupons. You had to have clothing coupons to buy clothes. Now, I have something here about the clothes. You needed 2 points, 2 tickets for a pair of stockings. You need 9 tickets to get a raincoat. You needed God knows how many, and you were only given so many clothing coupons that you could spend a month. And I went ice skating one day after work, and I left my handbag on the bus with my clothing coupons in. Okay, so it's funny, we hear all the planes going over, but we never see them because they don't come this way, they go that way. So, what was I saying? There was a big heavy fog in London. London suffered so many terrible P-fogs, what they call, that you couldn't see your hand like this in front of you. And the conductors on the buses used to go with flaming torches in the front of the bus to show the driver where to drive. And eventually it got so bad that they told the people they'll have to get off the bus and find their own way, which I did. But in all the excitement, I left my handbag on the bus. So the next day I got my handbag, but all my clothing coupons were missing. And of course there was no money in the purse, but I didn't care about that. I cared about the clothing coupons.
This is when you were engaged?
Yeah, because that was supposed to go to buy my wedding dress. Without the clothing coupons, I couldn't get a wedding dress. So all my mother's friends pitched in with coupons and got them all together so I could get my wedding dress.
But there was no material. What was your wedding dress made of?
The wedding dress was made of parachute silk. They had no material. And John Lewis, the big department store in London, used to save special material for young women to get their first evening gowns and things like that. So it was a beautiful gown. It was made by Couturier in London, in Cavendish Square, and it was copied from a Worth model that my mother-in-law had sent me the newspapers. She used to send newspapers from America to my husband, and in there was a picture of this gown. And Helen,
Yes.
could you show them the picture on the wall of the wedding gown? And it really was a beautiful gown. In fact, I think it was kept. It was sent to the cleaner and kept, but the kids used it for Purim.
No,
So-
they have it in the box.
And it would never fit anybody else anywhere. The only one it would fit was Shoshi. And she probably didn't like it. So, and the lily of the valley was grown specially for a bouquet. So, but every time I went for a fitting, she had to make it smaller and smaller.
To go back to what Dad was working in,
Now,
you only found out about it from this book?
yeah,
Which
from
was-
reading this book, they even then didn't tell me what he was doing, but he just said to me that was the work I was doing, but he never went into detail. Yad Sarah sent a journalist to interview him in his later years, and when he broached the subject about the enigma, my husband said, I don't think even today I should be talking about it. And this was like 30 years, 50 years later, and he never spoke about it. We've just now written a letter. I wrote a letter to the White House to say that these boys should be given a medal for the work that they did. They were never given a certificate, nothing. And because it was so hush-hush. And they wrote back, they said they only give medals if you're in combat. And they were not in combat. They were working behind the scenes. So,
Now, I have here what I had found yesterday looking for other information. A beautiful piece that my father wrote from his office during a quiet time about the work, about VJ Day, okay? And I'll just read one or two excerpts from it. He was writing to his parents, and he was on the typewriter that he used at work in Selfridge's basement, okay? And he says, Dearest mother and family, dad and family, we can well imagine your reactions to the wonderful news of the end of the war and the declaration of peace. It is now grand in knowing that with victory, a new era is being formulated which should see the end of all wars and the beginning of everlasting peace. Okay, that is the beginning of this whole letter. And later he talks about how it was celebrated. He says, I'm sorry. One second. We then took things easy. This is after he was on leave. Because of VJ Day, he was given 3 days off. And he says that in the morning, they went that night to, wait a second, wondering, a second. That they went to the park after celebrating all night, and they joined thousands of people outside Buckingham Palace. Let's see where that was. I should have done it. 1 second.
And we were shouting the Queen.
Here, yeah.
We were shouting, we want to see the royal family. And finally, after about a long time, they came out on the balcony.
So Dad wrote here, at about 11 in the evening, we all went through a park in front of the hotel to Buckingham Palace, where after shouting with the millions for an hour, the King and Queen appeared on the balcony. It was an impressive sight, especially with the Queen wearing all her jewels and a white ermine jacket. Okay, and that's how they celebrated VJ Day in London.
The present Queen Elizabeth and her youngest sister, Margaret Rose, were young girls. I mean, they were very young, and they were with the family, and it was wonderful. I'd never forget it.
Now, there was another celebration that you were invited to with Dad.
Oh, we, after the war, we were, all the fellows that were in the American unit and their girlfriends and wives were invited to Parliament by Winston Churchill for a garden party. And we all went to celebrate the end of the war, which was a wonderful experience also. And I mean, Winston Churchill really was a friend of the Jews. He really was. If you ever read his biography, he was a real Zionist. I mean, he believed in Israel, and he was upset when they cut it up, into different countries. And he really was a good friend to us, all of us. He was like Trump, but Trump's very controversial.
Now, you left England just after the war.
Well,
You left England.
I left. I got a ticket. I was pregnant, and I didn't want my mother to know, because I knew she wouldn't let me leave, and I wanted my children born in America. Because of a bad experience in a London hospital as a child. And I heard in those days, in America, they gave you something, put you to sleep. When you woke up, you've had the baby. And I said, that's for me. So I said, that's for me. So because they'd already booked her in England. During the war, they were so short of beds in the hospitals because of the wounded that you had to book a year ahead practically to get a bed. And I knew in England, if I had stayed in England, I would have had to have a cesarean. And it so happens when I went to America, they gave, I had a normal birth. It was not normal, but at least I had it the regular way. And so I didn't want to let my parents know, so I used to make believe I was going to the mikveh, and then I'd go and get into the local news theatre in downtown London to watch the news and spend the time and everything. So a friend of ours, an Israeli, who has an office in the American building on Karen Hayesod, Orient Shipping, I think his name was, and he was married to an English girl, and I was friendly with them, and he got me a ticket to go to America. Now they cancelled my ticket because it was a single person, and Churchill was going to meet with Truman in forgotten the name, Potsdam, is it? Potsdam. They were meeting with Stalin and Truman, and because FDR had died already, and so they bumped me off my off the plane. It was going to Boston, and I had to go to Hartford, which is halfway between Boston and New York. So I said to him, book me anywhere in the States where we were, just to get me out the country. So, because I was about 4 months pregnant then, by then. So he did. I could have landed up in California, but thank God it took me to Philadelphia. So the trip, my husband was still stationed in England, and he wasn't being, after the atom bomb was dropped, they were supposed to be sent to Japan. But once the atom bomb was dropped and we had peace in Japan, they sent the boys home eventually. So this was in February. January 22nd, I left from Bournemouth, Christchurch Airport, to go to Philadelphia. And
there's a story about the label on your baggage.
Said Christchurch. And when I came to America, my in-laws met me for the first time. I've got this big thing here with Christchurch written on it. So they said, for goodness sake, take that off. So, I mean, they didn't realize it was the name of an airport. Anyway, so I got on the plane, and it was not a jet plane. It was a four-propeller plane. It was a American Clipper, they called it, and it could land on the water. God forbid you got landed on the water, you could float. And we were taken. The first step was scheduled to go to Shannon Island, so we stopped there and overnight. But the weather was very bad. Ice was forming on the wings, and they said, we can't go any further, we have no ice. It was a converted DC-4 plane, an army plane, and we have no ice. I forgot the word.
De-ice.
Yeah, right. And so we landed there, and we were there for 36 hours because the weather wasn't getting any better. And there was an American engineer on the plane. He was traveling back and forth, and he said to me we could be here a week. And I didn't even know the history between Ireland and England, and how they hated the British, the Irish. And as I said, my husband was able to trace me where I was, and we spoke on the phone. They took us to a hotel outside of Limerick, and they heated the place with peat. And the smell of the peat, I was at the nausea stage. So my mother had given me 3 oranges because I was supposed to get there the next day. But of course, they didn't last very long, those oranges, and I had nothing to eat. And anyway, so I said to my husband, you know, if looks could kill, we'd be dead. Because when we go out walking down the street, the Irish look at you like with such hatred. So anyway, but they lost contact with us after that, because when we took off again, we got to the point of no return, and they said we're going to go on because it's no point going back again. So we went on, and we had to make a forced landing in Iceland. And I remember it was so cold and freezing, you couldn't put your foot down on the ground. It was like a sheet of ice. And these two rows of men in frog outfits handed you down until you got into the hangar. And then they gave you goat's milk, which didn't sit well either. And then we took off again, and we made another stop, which was scheduled in Newfoundland. And then we flew over New York. Did we go? Flew over Hartford to New York because we were going to Philadelphia. And the engineer said, that's where you're going to live. But so we landed in Philadelphia 5 days later after takeoff. Now, nobody knew what happened to the plane. My in-laws were traveling back and forth from Philadelphia to Atlantic City by taxi to meet a plane that never came. And anyway, finally 2 o'clock in the morning, the plane landed, and I felt so bad. I asked for a glass of water, and Philadelphia has the worst water in the country of America. It's fishy. It smelled of fish, tasted of fish. It was horrible, and I never drank water. And I said, for God's sake, what country is this with the water like that? But anyway, I realized afterwards that was only in that area that we had water. And they were staying at a kosher hotel in Atlantic City, which is now a gambling place. And I stayed there for a week to recuperate. But I'd never met my in-laws before. And I was going, in the hotel, I was going around opening all the windows because they had central heating. We never had central heating in England. We didn't have central heating until the 1950s in England. And it was so hot I couldn't stand it. It was January 26th, I remember I arrived. And my husband came a month later. He came back, but he was sick with the flu, and they never listed him on the list, a passenger list, and we didn't know what happened to him. He supposed to have gone to the clinic, and his buddies kidnapped him and put him away in his bunk, fed him juices and that, and he arrived in America, thank God, safely and sound. So that was my trip to America.
And after 25 years in America, you then moved to Israel, and you've been here, Kanai
A long time. We came in the 1970s.
49 years.
After the 67 war, we had just moved to a new area in Hartford, West Hartford, and it was a Friday, and they had a meeting on the common. They have a common space around the houses, and the church was there, the shuls were there, and there were no mosques then. No mosques, that's a recent thing. And and the church, and it was Friday, and according to the news we were getting, we were losing the war.
You're talking about the war in
the 6-Day War. And the church was saying, you've got to turn the other cheek. And I said to my husband, I think we're living in the wrong country. I said, how do they expect you with your back against the wall to turn your other cheek? So that was that in mind. And then the children bought us tickets to come visit Israel for our first trip ever, for our silver wedding, our 25th wedding anniversary. And we weren't going to go, but our a rabbi who was our friend said, go. So we went, and my husband was offered a job here, and 6 weeks after we went back, which was just before Pesach, we made up our minds to come on Aliyah. And that's how I finished up here. And I've been very happy all the time. I'm most happy coming to Alon Shvur to be with lovely people and among friends with a gorgeous view. In the daytime it's gorgeous here. I sit here and I look out over the hills of Yerushalayim and I can sit here and cry for joy. And that's,
We're happy you're here too.